Apologies for not making a video sooner. I got down with the sickness. In my last video, I talked about remasters and remakes. Today, I'll be comparing old games with new games, then weigh in all the pros and cons that each one has. Alrighty, without further delay, let's get started. Oh boy, that was a mess. It's nice to see how far video games have come in the graphical and animation department. Typically, characters or environments in modern games no longer look like cardboard cutouts whose hands and lips are glued together, even while they speak. Telepathy, I guess? Many present-day games look beautiful now. At the same time, a lot of modern games have been trapped in the 8th generation limbo for a number of years. What I mean is, modern games don't look much better than they did during the 8th generation of consoles. While graphics aren't everything, I feel like developers can do better than this. Like, come on, look at that. Some low-quality, fugly-ass textures, man. Like, that's like PS3 level assets right there. God damn! That is horrific. Compare that between the PS1 and PS2, for example, and the jump in the graphical department was far more apparent. Some modern games are also a step down in graphical quality from games made 10 years ago, such as Kill the Justice League when compared to Arkham Knight. Graphics were the least of that game's worries. The three things I don't miss from older games are the abysmal loading times, 480p resolution, and most titles being capped at 30 frames per second. Modern games have much higher frame rates, resolutions, and vastly improved loading times. This is clearly a huge plus. Sadly, those traits don't negate the new problem developers are facing. Many of them think making campaigns longer or game worlds bigger automatically equates to games being better. It doesn't. See, the bigger a game is, the more you'll struggle to fill it with meaningful content. This is why developers should adopt the quality over quantity approach. A lot of people, myself included, vastly prefer a smaller semi-open world packed with meaningful content over a large, bloated, overstuffed open world with an endless amount of repetitive, filler main missions and side activities. Games made back then were a reflection of the developers who created them, passionate and innovative. Compare that to modern games, and they show the developers under a very different light. Lazy, soulless, half-assed, and very money-hungry. Look no further than Ubisoft. Assassin's Creed in particular, a once revered franchise that went down the pooper. It had a clear focus, Assassins and the Templars. Templars? Fuck it, you know what I meant. The earlier Assassin's Creed titles lived up to their namesake. You learn to think, walk, talk, blend in, pick pockets, climb, and kill like an assassin, which allowed for both incredibly engaging stories and gameplay. The game's campaigns and map sizes were fairly lengthy, while at the same time, they weren't too big either. Back then, Ubisoft knew when to pump the brakes. Modern-day Assassin's Creed is like a dementia-ridden granny who is wandering aimlessly around a needlessly giant, dull, copy-and-pasted, samey-looking countryside. It's only Assassin's Creed in the name. At this point, it doesn't even know what it wants to be. That includes both the main and side mission design in modern-day Assassin's Creed games, which is super repetitive. Enter an enemy camp, clear it out, and repeat. That has to do with a lot of the original talent leaving the company, then working on the upcoming game Clair Obscur Expedition 33. In case you were wondering where all the actual talent went for Ubisoft, there's your answer. This, unfortunately, is an all too common practice within the video game industry. The original talent is replaced by brain-dead, uninspired fuckwits who take a big Mount Everest-sized shit on the company's once cherished reputation. Call of Recycled Dookie is another terrific example. Terrifically bad. The pinnacle of same shit, different pile. Paying full price for a game which has a campaign that's shorter than Peter Dinklage is diabolical. Or, as I like to call him, Hugh Laurie without a super mushroom. While you don't want games to be too long, you don't want them to be too short either. Balance is key. People are pretty much paying full price for the multiplayer component of Call of Duty, with the campaign being treated more like hors d'oeuvres. Except none of them are good. Just a bunch of celery and cauliflower. Ew. I don't doubt that Call of Duty was once a good franchise. Regrettably, those days are dead and gone. The bulk of players are not adults anymore. They're insufferable, obnoxious children who sound like they just discovered the concept of swearing and think it somehow makes them sound cooler. It doesn't, by the way. In all fairness, not all games released nowadays are bad. such as Astrobot, Stellar Blade, or Psychonauts 2. They feel like older games with modern touch-ups. Most importantly, they're games first and playable movies second, with a core focus on the single-player component. Don't fret, I will be talking about playable movies shortly. Indie games also provide a breath of fresh air. Somehow, a much smaller group of developers with limited money and resources can make a far better game than a giant multi-million or even billion-dollar studio with a shitload of people and resources. Now, why is that exactly? Simple. Because indie developers see gaming as a form of art, and so they take it very seriously. While many AAA developers or publishers, on the other hand, see gaming as a get-rich-quick scheme. Reuse assets like a motherfucker to save a lot of time and money, then release a sequel every year. The frequency of really good games being released nowadays is far lesser than it once was, by a considerable amount. This, of course, is only natural, as whenever really good modern games do come out, they take much longer to make than really good older games due to the massive technological leaps in graphics, animation, and AI. Hashtag way to state the obvious. Do you guys remember when you could simply buy a game in its entirety, pop a game into the disk drive, boot it up, then start playing right away? Well, tough poopy diaper. You can't do that nowadays because games require massive day one pre-weight loss Mama June sized updates. Like I said, games nowadays are much bigger than they used to be. Needlessly so. If any developers come across this video, hear me out. Stop focusing on the size of your game's map and start focusing on filling it with quality content instead. That way, gamers won't have to wait 20,000 hours for the game to finish installing. I'm sure for some people it takes no time at all, but not everyone has lightning fast internet speed. Games back then had bugs and glitches because of their lack of updates, Jesse. Modern games still have bugs and glitches even with updates. You silly dink. Many games nowadays, even with updates, also have more bugs and glitches than older games did. That's exactly why developers should take more time when working on a game. Then release it only when it's damn well good and ready to be released. That means without bugs and glitches. Optimization is another issue that a lot of developers seem to have a problem with. I know what I said before about games running better than they did in the past. That still reigns true. But there are some examples out there of modern games that are poorly optimized, like Monster Hunter Wilds, for example. While it runs fine on the Pro, the same can't be said for the base PS5's performance. The game runs at 720p in performance mode on the base PS5. 720p in 2025 is unacceptable, Capcom. It's disgusting. You should be ashamed of yourselves. Pure, 100% unadulterated laziness on your part. If you guys can't correctly optimize a game yourselves, then get someone else to do it for you. I'm sure there's plenty of people out there, plenty of companies who would do it for you and optimize the game far better than you could. It's not like you don't have the money to make it happen, so make it happen. Another reason why you can't just boot up a game and play it right away anymore is having to accept user agreements before you can play a game. Sorry, I had to laugh at just the absurdity of the entire thing. It's ridiculous. I already bought it. Is that not enough? These people have the balls to say that you don't actually own the game, just the license to use it. How is that fair when gamers bought it with their money? When a gamer buys a game with their money, they should be entitled to owning it. That's how purchases work. I apologize for the anger, but, even though I'm reading from a script, the anger is all too genuine. You're conning your consumers. This kind of business practice warrants a full-forced kick in the nuts by someone wearing a Timberland boot. And what the fuck am I agreeing to anyway? Unwillingly parting with my kidneys? You assholes know full well that people like me will never end up reading those contracts. Don't give me that, it's for the gamer's protection, when you most likely pawn off our personal data to some other company. It's all for your own personal gain, not the players. Anyone who puts user agreements in their game. I hope a mosquito lands in your eye and shoves its proboscis deep inside your cornea. Story in games do matter. In any case, gameplay should always be king, just like it was before for older games. Unluckily, many games nowadays do the complete opposite. Let me give you some examples. The Last of Us might have a really good story. Despite this, it still feels more like an interactive movie than a playable game. I'm not saying it's bad. All I'm saying is its gameplay isn't nearly as good as its story. The problem with playable movie games is gameplay typically takes a back seat. The Last of Us also has one thing that I can't stand. Very slow, on-the-rail talking and walking segments. Jesse, how are the characters supposed to talk to each other then? They can't talk during actual gameplay? I don't mean while they're fighting for their lives. I mean during the quieter moments where you're exploring out in the field, and there's no sign of danger nearby. Slow walking and talking segments exist for the sole purpose of arbitrarily extending the game's runtime. Developers can't think of a creative way to have characters interact with each other without slowing the game down to a dead man's crawl. A lot of modern games don't innovate enough. They feel too safe. Developers shouldn't be afraid to take some risks. Sometimes it can result in a disastrous product. On the other hand, if done correctly, it can result in something wonderful. For example, Capcom took a giant leap of faith with Resident Evil 4 back in the day. It's a huge departure from the original Resident Evil trilogy, and yet it still paid off beautifully due to being a brilliantly executed product. I would also argue that Metroid Prime is a huge departure from the typical 2D formula. Again, it paid off beautifully as Retro Studios still managed to make the Prime games play, feel, look, and sound like Metroid. Sly Cooper 2 is another example of a sequel being a huge departure from the first game. It started off by having very limited mission variety, where the end goal was always the same. Collect 7 keys in each world before you could finally gain access to the boss's hideout. Sly 2, on the other hand, drastically changed things up. No longer do players have to collect keys at the end of every level. Instead, each world is treated more like a semi-open world with much more varied missions and objectives for the player to tackle. You can properly play as Bentley and Murray now as well. Those are really cool additions. These changes in gameplay also paid off, as Sly 2 is considered the best of the franchise. Then you have games like Tears of the Kingdom, God of War Ragnarok, and Spider-Man 2. Despite having some cool new additions over the prequels, are 3 examples of sequels that feel too safe. In terms of gameplay, Ragnarok, much like Tears of the Kingdom and Spider-Man 2, don't innovate enough with their gameplay and map designs as a sequel should. All 3 games reuse maps. It would have been better off if they took place in entirely different locations. In Spider-Man's case, a different area of New York. Aside from the new areas you could explore in Spider-Man 2, I mean. New York is a pretty damn big place. I don't see why not. In Ragnarok's case, let the players explore new areas within Midgard instead of retreading the Lake of Nine again. I will give Ragnarok some credit for letting you explore new areas in already existing realms like Elfheim or exploring new realms entirely like Vanaheim. Even then, as a sequel, it still feels a little too safe for my liking. This is only my opinion, of course. You don't have to agree with it, that's fine. Then, you have Tears of the Kingdom. I've had enough of Hyrule to last 10 fucking lifetimes. Hyrule needs to fuck off for a very long time. Center the focus on a new place already. Nintendo has already proven they can create a captivating new location in the Zelda universe in the form of Termina. Stands to reason they can do it again. I'm not saying they should wipe the slate clean and remake every single asset from scratch for sequels. All I'm saying is they should do more than the bare minimum. Games back then also released in their entirety. There were no DLC or expansion passes. If you wanted more content, then you had to wait for a sequel. God of War Ragnarok may have its issues in the narrative department. Nevertheless, I gotta give massive props to Santa Monica for how they handled the Valhalla DLC. They very well could have locked it behind a paywall, yet they didn't. It's entirely free, and that's how DLC should be done. Most other video game companies would have had players pay at least 20 fucking smackaroos for the Valhalla DLC. As much as I love Capcom, they have microtransactions in their games as well, such as Monster Hunter Wilds and the Resident Evil 4 remake, usually in the form of cosmetics. There are golden tickets that let you purchase more powerful weapon upgrades faster. But what the fuck is this? Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory? I'll wipe my custom-made chocolate all over him. Taking a page out of the mobile gaming book, I see. Not cool, Capcom.
Not cool. You have no idea how not cool that shit is.
It gets worse. The Resident Evil 4 remake locks the option to pick between the remake soundtrack and the original soundtrack behind a paywall. The Reignited trilogy, on the other hand, gave players the option to switch between the Reignited and original soundtrack for free. Here's the worst example of locking something behind a paywall for a paid-for game that I have ever seen. Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth. While I enjoyed that game, they locked difficulty settings behind a fucking paywall. The other thing they should have never locked behind a paywall for Infinite Wealth is New Game Plus. Why? What's wrong with you people? It's just pure greed. A standard feature, whether it's switching between soundtracks or difficulty settings, should not be locked behind a paywall. Period. Putting microtransactions of any kind in a game that players already paid for is absolutely disgusting. You gaming companies are a bunch of money-grubbing shitbirds. No one back then ever made such a terrible decision since companies seemingly cared about their consumers more. Microtransactions should choke to death on a giant erect giraffe dick. If the microtransactions don't get in the way of the main game, then what's the big deal? You're missing the point. If you start accepting the small things, then eventually, companies will think it's okay to shove microtransactions within the main story of an already paid-for game. If you think they wouldn't, then think again. Crazier things have happened, like the live-action remake of Snow White. More like brown sugar and the 7 bite-sized CGI molesters. Microtransactions shouldn't exist.
End of story.
Then there's live service games. Concord was a disastrous, uninspired flop fest. Like deep discount Guardians of the Galaxy. Atrocious character designs, cliche gameplay that has been done to death, jumping around on giant trampolines, I guess, in boring, lifeless worlds as an artistically mundane looking character. Complete with force fields and laser guns. And the worst of all, modern MCU humor with one too many dashes of cringe. Kill the Justice League is the second testicle that makes up the incredibly passionless nutsack. You put Kill the Justice League beside Concord, and they might as well be the same damn game. I don't know about Kill the Justice League, but I'm more than certain in Concord's case you had to rely on a constant internet connection in order to play it. They expected you to pay money for a product that you wouldn't even own. Let that marinate for a few seconds. I'm not saying good multiplayer games can't be made, but they should at least have some original ideas and not cost a dime if relying on a constant internet connection is a requirement to play them. The problem with live service games is they have a deadline. When support for them inevitably ends, then that means you'll no longer be able to play them. All the work developers put into that game will be rendered useless. Next topic of conversation is multiplayer. People who played multiplayer back then did it on the couch in the same room. In my opinion, it was a lot better than what we have now, because you could actually see the person you were gaming with. In turn, you connected with them on a better, more personal level. Unlike nowadays, where you're conversing with a bunch of disembodied voices over a microphone that brag about how they fucked your mum. Yeah, I'll take it didn't happen for $10,000. This, surprisingly, does not have the same impact as having multiplayer sessions in person does. Most, if not all people you game with online, you'll never end up meeting them in real life anyway. Even if you know the person you're talking to, it still doesn't hit you the same way as playing with them in person would. Then there's collector's editions. Collector's editions were more reasonably priced back then, and they came with the disc. Nowadays, in a lot of cases, if you buy the collector's edition for a game, then you only receive the digital version with it. Sony. They could have two options, a collector's edition that includes the physical disc, and a collector's edition that doesn't. Or they could include the disc and the digital code in the same collector's edition box. Oh my god, of course, what was I thinking? That would involve not being a cheap, greedy prick and actually giving a shit about your customers. And we all know you can't do that. Obviously, with everything I've been saying throughout the entire video about modern titles, it's clear that older games are better. What makes older games better though? Some people would solely argue that it's nostalgia. No, it's more than that. Here's a more straightforward answer as to why older games are better than newer games. The aesthetic, characters, story, music, ingenuity, innovation, focus on gameplay over being playable movies, fun and replay factors, and the game being released in its entirety, because some titles don't in fact release in their entirety nowadays, aka DLC. Those are all qualities most modern titles don't have. Kind of games you can play through a billion times over and never get tired of. Meanwhile, most modern games we pick up, play, beat them once, maybe twice, then never pick them up again. It also helps that many older games have aged like honey. Honey. Which makes them much easier to revisit. Sadly, some older titles have aged like piss. Jesse, if you have such an issue with newer games, then why don't you just play older games? It's like I said, not every new release is bad. Is it a crime for me to want better for the video game industry? I want them to remember what made games so special in the first place. Okie dokie, that'll do it for this video. Let me know in the comments below what games you grew up playing throughout your childhood. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna fall asleep and dream about playing Spyro 4, since that seems to be the only fucking way that anyone will ever play it.